Once upon a time, there was a little girl who loved to play in the snow. Her little cheeks were rosy red. The winter wind made them that way, but inside she was warm, because she could tell by the fluffy snow, bushy trees, the twinkling lights, and the jingling sleigh bells that in just a few days, Christmas would be here, the day she had been waiting so long for. But that was a long, long time ago, almost a year, and the thought of Christmas now seemed far away. And indeed it was, because the little girl's father had moved his family to a place far from where they had lived before. On the big map her father showed her, the little girl saw her new home was not colored green like their old state, but brown, like a desert.
Today, 78 degrees under sunny skies. KTR.
Everything was different here. The trees seemed much taller, but had few branches. The snow she loved to play in was nowhere to be found. Just brown rocks and funny little plants with prickly needles. She sat in her new front yard and remembered the giant tree that grew in her old neighborhood and how last year it was decorated with twinkling lights. This year, there were no lights, and the only tree around was the saddest thing she ever saw. It confused the little girl because even though her father told her that Christmas would soon be here, how would anybody know without the winter wind, fluffy snow, bushy trees, twinkling lights, and jingling sleigh bells to remind them? Here, she said to herself, there is none of that. And she thought sadly, there might not be any Christmas either. The next day, on her way to school, the little girl decided she would have to go back to her old house. She felt certain that there she would find the Christmas this new place forgot. So instead of turning the corner to school, the little girl walked the other way. As she went, she became more and more excited, thinking in just a few days she would be back in her old state where everyone remembers Christmas. She would be so happy to leave a striped candy cane for Santa Claus on Christmas Eve, just as she had all the Christmases before. But first, she would have to buy a striped candy cane, so she headed across the crowded parking lot to a big store. When the little girl saw the two men arguing, she thought maybe they had forgotten Christmas. Once in the store, the little girl felt so small among all the big people. Even though she knew where the candy was, getting there was like hacking a trail through a dense jungle.
Who's next?
I like a cookie and busman. No, I was in line
No,
first.
I was.
No, I was here before you were.
As she watched the grown-ups, she felt sorry for them. How could they ever get the Christmas spirit if they didn't have the winter winds and all the other things to remind them that it was Christmas? Stepping to the counter, the little girl reached in her pocket for the few coins she had, picked out a medium-sized striped candy cane, for that was all she could afford, and gave them to the clerk, knowing now that there was no choice but to go back to her old home where Christmas would be remembered. She was certain these people really had forgotten Christmas. As the afternoon waned, she walked on, wondering, and almost ran right into a man dressed in a strange smock, ringing a bell. She stopped and looked up at him, almost trembling, then looked away. She had never seen anyone like this before. The next thing the little girl heard was the sound of metal clanking. She looked up, and there was another grown-up putting coins into the bucket. Shyly, the little girl asked the man in the funny uniform,
"Why does the man put the money in the bucket?"
To which the man answered, so that all the poor people who can't afford it will have a Merry Christmas. The little girl was dumbfounded. She could hardly believe her ears.
Christmas, how could it be Christmas when it's so brown here?
Little girl, the man replied, the color of the ground has nothing to do with Christmas. It is the feeling in your heart that matters. She took the striped candy cane from her pocket, looked at it questioningly, and walked on. The little girl was plainly surprised to see her father's best friend, Mr. Knoll, waiting at the curb.
Hi, Angela. Want a ride?
The little girl nodded and hopped in. Then the little girl told him she wanted to go to the airport and told Mr. Knoll the rest of the story about this new place and how it forgot Christmas. When they got to the airport, the grown-up looked at her and smiled.
Well, you mind if I go inside with you and help you find the plane? It's kind of crowded around here.
She took his hand timidly and headed inside, as Mr. Knoll remarked that most of the people here are just arriving, not leaving.
A lot of people come here for Christmas because it's warmer here.
The little girl was startled and more confused than ever. Nonetheless, she was glad about all the happiness around them. think of was, if there were no winter winds or fluffy snow or those other things, why would all these people come here for Christmas? She had to think hard about Mr. Noel's answer, that the snow and bells really are not Christmas.
What's the good feelings that people have for each other that make Christmas Christmas?
She groped for her striped candy cane. It was still there, and thought to herself a moment. Knowing that if there really is a Christmas at her new home, Santa would come here to eat her candy cane just as he did at her old house. She looked up at the grown-up, took his hand, and led him to the door.
Okay, well, bye-bye now.
Bye.
When they arrived home, the little girl was surprised to see a new Christmas tree and the rest of the family decorating it. She didn't know that her father had just bought it and was beginning to worry about his little girl who had not come home from school. As she waved goodbye to Mr. Noel and went in the house, she had a warm feeling, just like last Christmas, even though there was no winter wind or fluffy snow or twinkling lights or jingling sleigh bells. Because that day, she had discovered what Christmas is. Holding the product of her day's journey and studying it, she wondered to herself if Santa Claus would know how special this candy cane really is.
Of course he will. Santa Claus knows everything.